Alright guys, welcome back to Queens of the Damned, a horror podcast. This week we are diving back into our Decades series, finally, and we are up to the 50s now, which I think all three of us have been waiting for. The 50s were a great time for horror. So this week we have chosen our own movies, our favorite movies from the 50s, and we talk a little bit about the history behind them and what was going on in the world that inspired these movies. Happy listening.
So, in Hollywood in the 1950s, obviously, things were changing, and that's because the whole world changed in the 40s, right? We have now come out of World War II, and some of the baby boomers, by the mid to late 50s are getting to be like 10, 12, 15 years old, right? Ones that were born immediately following World War II. So obviously that changes what people wanted in their entertainment. People wanted something that was politically relevant, but they also wanted to be able to escape. They also wanted to escape from their problems, and they could see something that was politically relevant, but also, kind of stupid. And so you didn't really have to think when you went to the movies. So one of the big changes is that in 1952, there was a court case. It was Joseph Burstyn Inc. versus Wilson. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that movies were free speech. So they were protected under the First Amendment. So this pretty much got rid of the Hollywood Production Code, which I know we've talked about in previous episodes. So filmmakers now, and at this point, more and more filmmakers had been releasing movies independently outside of the major studios because they didn't want to adhere to the production code. But now, even in the major studios, filmmakers could kind of do what they wanted. They could really let their imaginations run rampant. And studios started to realize that people, especially teenagers in this post-war era, were really into going to the movies. So they started to release a new category of movie, which we now know as B movies. But the way that they got their name is when you would go to the movie, it would always be a double feature, right? And you have your A movie, which was like the good movie, the big budget, decent movie. And then you would have the second movie, which was the B movie. And that was like the low budget, kind of shitty movie. And so anyway, these teenagers were just flocking to the movies. They were flocking to the drive-in to see these movies. They didn't care if the plot was bad. They didn't care if it didn't make any sense. They didn't care if the dialogue was crappy. They didn't care if the characters, had no characterization. All they cared about is that it was an escape, right? An escape from the real world, an escape from the fears of the day, which we're going to get into a little bit later. And so Hollywood studios basically started churning out these very low budget movies. That's kind of the history of the B movie. There were these low budget, sometimes wildly inventive, that actually end up withstanding the test of time and are still good movies, or at least fun movies to still watch. And some of them, are lost in, Hollywood Babylon. They're gone. They're not in print. They're not streaming. Good luck ever finding it anywhere. Yeah. So that's kind of what was going on, like I said, in the movie industry in the 50s. The whole industry was really changing very rapidly after the war. Just like the whole world changed after the war. Right? It's kind of hard, I think, for us to understand, because obviously we weren't around, the impact that World War II had on the culture of not just America, but everywhere. Yeah. Right? It really changed the entire world and changed the landscape of the entire world pretty much, because almost everybody was involved. So, take it away, Miranda.
Awesome. In 1947, the Soviet Union releases I'm going to say this wrong, and I'm just going to accept it as that, the Zhdanov Doctrine, because I don't speak Russian. which declared that the United States was attempting to dominate the world through imperialism. And the United States then declares war on the containment of communism through the long telegram as a response. What then ensued was a Cold War that would last nearly 50 years. And as we've said before, I mean, several times we've had this conversation, that horror movies and novels and everything are just, for the most part, a reflection of the world that you live in. And the 50s were clearly no different. The Cold War incited the Red Scare, which referred to the fear every American shared of communism entering their country, their neighborhoods, or even their homes. They feared they couldn't trust anyone around them, and they even likened communism to evil. And in 1950, Joseph McCarthy developed a campaign to blacklist any Americans that he thought could be linked to communism. And McCarthyism was often used to blacklist anyone deemed untrustworthy or unlikable. I mean, it basically came down to somebody could say one thing that Joseph McCarthy didn't like, and they were done for. Mm-hmm. One of them that I always think of, and of course I can't remember his name right now, the author who wrote
Arthur Miller?
Fear and Loathing in Las
Hunter
Vegas.
S. Thompson?
Yes, Hunter S. Thompson. He was blacklisted. That guy didn't do anything to anybody. Anyways.
I always think of Arthur
like,
Miller,
Americans...
the one who wrote The Crucible. And so that's who I thought you were going to say.
Right.
Sorry. Nope, Hunter S. Thompson. But yeah, like, I mean, Americans were seeing, like, these people who they like, these people on TV, they're seeing, like, their neighbors that they trusted, and they're all being taken down by McCarthyism, so it developed this feeling that absolutely no one around them could be trusted, and that communism was just coming in and absorbing everyone, which is, I'm not going to talk about The Blob, but The Blob is one of my favorite movies to talk about communism, because, oh, it's so perfect, because it's that same idea of, like, this ideology just coming in and absorbing everything and growing, and, yeah.
And The Blob is, like
literally
red.
Yes.
Like...
Yes. Oh, I love The Blob.
I do
like,
too.
I wasn't sure if I was going to choose The Blob or the movie that I chose. Just watch The Blob if you haven't seen it. It's so good.
The original,
okay.
not the shitty remake.
Yes. But yeah, anyways, like, most of the people who were accused of being associated with the Communist Party, they weren't. Like, the majority of them were not at all associated with the Communist Party. But like I said, it developed a feeling of, like, there's no one around you that you can trust. And America also viewed communism as this ideology based on the idea that individuality was wrong and that all citizens needed to be the same. So that's how we end up with films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which is the movie that I chose. Because it really embodies the Red Scare, like, to a T. It's one of my favorite movies, and I also want to say, it has a couple remakes, and they really aren't bad. I love the Leonard Nimoy one. That was the one that I saw first.
Okay.
And that's a good movie, but yeah. This one is, obviously, it's gonna be the best one. For those who haven't seen Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I know it's kind of a well-known movie, but it focuses on a small town, Santa Mira, and the supposed hysteria that's been spreading amongst the townsfolk. So when Dr. Miles arrives to town, he sees several patients complaining their relatives aren't really their relatives. And he tries to kind of write it off as mass hysteria until he sees for himself a literal duplicate of his friend lying in his house. And this duplicate has very vague features and no fingerprints, as if it hasn't fully formed yet or become like a real person. And eventually he finds another body, and then he finally finds a pod, creating one of those bodies. And basically we call them pod people. The pod people look exactly like your friends and your family. They have the same memories, the same mannerisms, but somehow they aren't them. There's just somehow you just know that they aren't the same person. And before he knows it, Miles is pretty much just surrounded by pod people. The whole town is pod people. So he discovers that pod people have no emotions, they have no faith, no ambition, and all of them are the same. Like, they just completely act the same. And because of this, they claim that the world is completely untroubled and simple. But Miles argues that becoming a pod person is the death of the soul and decides to kind of fight back against it. But once he finally escapes Santa Mira, after he literally has the whole town chasing after him, he explains to a psychiatrist what's happened, and of course, at first, they're like, oh, he's crazy. No. Until a man reports that he pulled a body out of a pod, and that's when they close the roads to all traffic and hope that they keep the pod people out, and that's basically where the movie ends. And there are so many moments in the movie that feel like they're speaking directly about communism. And I kind of laughed at this one, but there's an instance where Dr. Miles screams, "They're here already, and you're next," into the camera, and it felt like an anti-communism propaganda ad. It was amazing. But they also refer to the pod people as, like, a malignant disease that's spreading through the country. And, more often than not, that's how communism was treated during the 50s. But, the only thing more terrifying than a disease is one which there are literally no discernible physical differences. Which is what makes this movie so scary. I mean, something is spreading, but you have no idea who has it.
Mm-hmm.
So, according to Invasion of the Body Snatchers, communism was coming for not just an American value, but a very human value, and that's the desire to love, to be happy, and to experience life fully. But communism apparently also threatens one very American value, and that is the freedom to be an individual. According to the Red Scare and McCarthyism, communism would take away anybody's freedom to be themselves, which is an American value embedded in our law. So yeah, I mean, the whole movie just, in and of itself, is, to me, like, a really, really great representation of what Americans were afraid of during the 50s, which is why it's one of my favorites. And I think, like, it's been remade so many times. I want to say there's 2 more remakes of this. There's one from the early 2000s and one from the 70s. But I think it just goes to show, like, this is something that we are continuously scared of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, these ideologies, let's just, like, entering the world, like, these ideologies that we're scared of, that we don't understand, coming in and invading and not really knowing what to do, or, feeling out of place in your own home, basically.
It's like a rehashing of the other, it's the other idea.
Right.
Pretty much, yeah.
But not just the other. I mean, the idea of not really knowing people that you think you know, right? I mean, you think you know your friends, but your friend might be a secret communist.
Yeah.
And how can you really trust anybody? And I think that's what a lot of the Red Scare was, is it was sowing distrust among just, like, communities, because it would be like, yeah, I'm just standing here talking to you, Nikki, but how do I know that you're not a communist? And how do you know I'm not a communist? Right? And so it was really turning neighbor against neighbor. I mean, people who ratted people out to McCarthy are, like, the fucking lowest of the low. People who name names are, like, pieces of shit forever, in my book.
Yeah.
Because half the time, and also, I mean, just this idea that you could belong to a political party and have your life ruined for it is ridiculous. It's not like they were members of, like, NAMBLA.
Right.
I mean, they were communists, which is perfectly legal.
Yeah.
And not immoral.
Yeah. Well, and it's also kind of hypocritical, I think, to be so scared that you're going to have this American value taken away from you, so you take away other people's freedom of speech or whatnot to do it. Kind of defeats the purpose a little bit, doesn't it?
Isn't that the way it always works?
Oh, he wrote a play I don't like.
Right. Right.
Like...
Right. Or, oh my god, he expressed sympathy one time for somebody who may or may not be a communist, so... And, I mean, I think some of the people who named names were just, like, pulling shit out of thin air to save their own butts, because they were so scared of getting blacklisted that they were just, like, giving people names, but you're a real piece of shit for that.
Ironically, it's kind of like a witch trials thing
Hence
all
the
over
crucible.
again.
That's exactly what I was
there
thinking.
it is.
Yes, it's like the same phenomenon. Yeah,
It's the exact same phenomenon. Only nobody died.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's the exact same phenomenon. I mean, and you know that Joseph McCarthy is currently undergoing a renaissance with the right wing. They all love him again.
Oh, Jesus.
Makes sense.
I know. Yep.
Well, I was just thinking to myself, like, this whole narrative would fit so well right now. Like, I was just sitting here thinking, I'm surprised we're not getting another remake.
It really would.
The
It really would fit well right now.
The theme is really enduring. I mean, they just used it in Sabrina. There's a movie that came out a couple of years ago called The Honeymoon. I don't know if either of you saw it.
Yes.
It's an indie
I loved
film.
that movie.
And sorry, I gave away the whole thing because you don't really find out until the end, but it turns out she's like a pod person or like a body snatcher or something.
I love that movie so much.
It's really subtle and amazing, I thought. I'm going to have to give it another watch.
Yeah.
So,
I loved that movie.
I think you're right, Miranda, that we just like, it's just gonna, I think that's something
it's
always
just
going to endure.
It's a vicious cycle. And some of it is just human nature, you know? Some of it is just human nature. It's certainly not unique to this country.
Right.
You know, I'm sure if we lived in other countries, we would also be complaining about the same thing, only in a slightly different way. So I think, unfortunately, it's just human nature that you never really, you know, you're scared of what you don't understand, or you're scared of your life changing, or like you said, you know, taking away our way of life. I don't know so this show doesn't take place in the 50s, it takes place in the 80s, but I don't know if either of you watched The Americans.
No,
I've been wanting to,
highly recommend it to you guys, to everyone listening. It basically takes this same concept that there could be Russian spies living among us and we wouldn't even know, right? They could pass themselves off as ordinary Americans, and that's the plot of the show. It's two Russian spies who are married and have children and are passing themselves off as like Jim and Sue next door, and you know, they're working to take down our government the entire time. It's so good. I just like any opportunity to plug The Americans. It's amazing.
Well, I think that's all I have about Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Rachel, what other thing were we scared of in the 50s that we're probably also scared of today?
Now, yes, this is a threat that has continued and probably will continue until there's another sort of disaster. But the other thing that we were really scared of in the 50s is obviously the thing that won the war, right? The thing that finally ended the war in Japan is when we dropped the bomb twice, right? On Hiroshima and on Nagasaki. And I think back to the logs that were made by, I believe it was one of the scientists who was in the plane that dropped the first bomb. And in the logs, you know, he's like pumped. They're going to do it. They're actually going to see this bomb in action. Oh my God. And then they drop it and it goes off. And his next entry is, my God, what have we done? Because it was sort of an abstract concept. They knew what this bomb could do. But until they dropped it and they saw what it did, it never actually dawned on them what happened. Like, I know a lot of the scientists in the Manhattan Project ended up becoming staunch anti-nuclear advocates later in their lives, right? Because they had such guilt for what they had actually done. They were so caught up in the possibilities of what the bomb could do that it didn't dawn on them that, like, yeah, it was actually going to do that. Right? Like, it didn't quite connect. Like, they had the idea of what it could do, and then when they saw what it did, it was like, oh shit, you know? So, that's the same with the general American public, you know? Japan had an extremely strong army. Japan had probably the strongest army in the entire world at the time. And it slowly dawned on us, we obviously also had an extremely strong army, that it didn't matter how strong our army was, or how brave our soldiers were, or how willing they were to die for our country. All that it would take was one piece of technology, and a city could be wiped off the map. And that was very scary for people. You know, that was terrifying. And when they saw the devastation that the bombs had caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you know, it started to take its toll. And people started to be afraid, back to the Red Scare, that the Russians were going to drop a nuke on us. You know, you go forward a few years and you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously. And so that was a big fear. Another big fear was the effects of radiation poisoning. Again, we saw what radiation poisoning did to the people in Japan. And we saw what it did to a lot of the service members who were in charge of testing the bombs, right? Out in New Mexico in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, we saw the devastating effects of radiation. And so that became a huge fear, not just for us, obviously, but for people around the world. So you really see in American movies things about the effect of radiation. You know, you see movies like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman or Them, which I think is about giant ants.
Yes.
Yes. And then there's also one called like They and It. It's just like all the like pronouns. And you know, and then you have ones where they go the opposite. You know, the original version of The Fly, right? Where these rays, quote unquote, you can't see me, but these rays that were able to shrink or grow or otherwise distort things and people that we knew. Obviously, as much as the bombing and the effects of nuclear war affected us, they mostly affected people in Japan, right? They were the ones dealing with the devastating after effects for decades afterwards. And so this inspired the director Ishiro Hondo to make the 1954 ultimate kaiju classic, the movie that got me into horror, Godzilla. So I'm not going to go super detail into the plot of Godzilla. I feel like everyone basically knows what happens in a Godzilla movie. So in the first movie, Godzilla is awoken from under the sea under the Pacific Ocean by hydrogen bomb testing. And it's never said in the movie that it's the US testing these bombs, but like it's highly, highly, highly suggested that it's the United States. So he comes back, he comes on land, he destroys a bunch of stuff, he kills a bunch of people, right? The scientists work to destroy him, and eventually at the end of the movie, they do kill him. But the main scientist, who is a woman, I will say, which is great, basically warns the other scientists and the audience that future nuclear bomb testing may cause another Godzilla to rise, right? So that's how the movie ends. So Godzilla is meant to symbolize pretty clearly nuclear holocaust from Japan's point of view. The producer, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to butcher this first name, but Tomoyuki, and his last name is Tanaka, so Tomoyuki Tanaka, said that the theme of the film from the beginning was the terror of the bomb. Mankind had created the bomb, and now nature was going to take revenge on mankind. So that was kind of their idea behind it, is we've created this horrible thing, right? And now nature is so angry almost at what we're doing to each other that it's going to unleash something on us to punish us for what we've done. So the director, Ishiro Hondo, said that he filmed Godzilla's very famous first Tokyo rampage to mirror the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he said if Godzilla had been a dinosaur or some other animal, he would have been killed by just one cannonball. But if he were equal to an atomic bomb, we wouldn't know what to do. So I took the characteristics of an atomic bomb and applied them to Godzilla. So Godzilla is supposed to be not only something that was brought back by the atomic bomb, but also equal to an atomic bomb itself. So I read this really good book a few years ago, which I dug out for this episode. It's called Godzilla on My Mind. And it's basically just, I got it at the book rack, and it's basically just a bunch of essays about Godzilla, right? About his cultural impact, about the symbolism behind it, all that kind of stuff. It's a really fun book. I enjoyed it. It's a very quick read. But some of the academics in that book stated that Godzilla contained political and cultural undertones that can be attributed to what the Japanese had experienced in World War II, and that Japanese audiences were able to connect emotionally to Godzilla. They theorized that viewers saw Godzilla as a victim and felt that the creature's backstory reminded them of their experience in World War II. So Godzilla didn't ask to be awoken, right? He was peacefully slumbering under the ocean. But because we couldn't stop fucking shit up, we awoke him from his slumber, and now he was being punished, right? He's just doing what monsters do. And we killed him in the end because he's just doing what needed to be done. And Japan, I think, really felt that way. You know, they felt like they were just defending their own interests. And sure, they attacked us first, but we basically went in there and bombed the shit out of them, causing them to surrender and kind of devastating their country with effects that are still seen today. The movie, in a way, can be seen to blame the United States for the problems and struggles that Japan experienced after World War II had ended, which again, some of those struggles they are still experiencing today. And these academics also say that they feel the movie could have served as a cultural coping method to help the people of Japan move on from the events of the war. In New York Magazine, the film critic Mark Jacobson said that Godzilla, guys, I shouldn't have had that frose, said that Godzilla transcends humanist prattle. Very few constructs have so perfectly embodied the overriding fears of a particular era. He is the symbol of a world gone wrong, a work of man that once created cannot be taken back or deleted. He rears up out of the sea as a creature of no particular belief system, apart from even the most elastic version of evolution and taxonomy, a reptilian id that lives inside the deepest recesses of the collective unconscious that cannot be reasoned with, a merciless undertaker who broaches no deals. So you can see where people could take that to mean that's what we were like during the war, right? Now, I personally would never have wanted to be in Harry Truman's shoes and had to make the decision of whether to drop the bomb or not, right?
Yeah.
On one hand, it was a horrific tragedy. It killed thousands and thousands of innocent people. It devastated an entire country. But on the other hand, Japan was never going to stop. They were never going to stop fighting. The war was going to go on forever. And this was the only way to end it. And I don't know. I don't know what I would have done. But you can see where they saw Godzilla as sort of this id that was this merciless undertaker. You know, that's how Japan saw the United States, as just these merciless people who were willing to just drop bombs willy-nilly until Japan gave up. Right?
Yeah.
And then finally, Tim Martin, a film critic from the Daily Telegraph, stated that the original 1954 film was a far cry from its B-movie successors. It was a sober allegory of a film with ambitions as large as its thrice normal budget, designed to shock and horrify an adult audience. Its roster of frightening images, cities in flames, overstuffed hospitals, irradiated children, would have been all too familiar to cinema-goers, for whom memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still less than a decade old, while its script posed deliberately inflammatory questions about the balance of post-war power and the development of nuclear energy. So, Godzilla was a hit in Japan. It was barely screened in the United States. The only places that it was really screened would have been places like California, where they had, in major cities, a larger Japanese population. But somebody in America saw it and they liked it, so they bought the rights. And in 1956, an American recut of the film was released as Godzilla King of the Monsters. Now, I guarantee you, if you have seen the original Godzilla, 9 times out of 10, this is the version that you have seen. This is the version that I first saw. This is the version that I saw up until probably about 15 years ago. Because the original version was not released on DVD in North America until 2006.
That's what I thought. I thought it wasn't available.
Wow.
Yes. Now, it was in theaters briefly in 2004, and I did see it in theaters. My dad and I made a trek to go see it, because we're huge Godzilla fans. But, yeah, most people had not seen it. So, in the American recut, they basically edit in an American character played by Raymond Burr. And he is a journalist, an American journalist that's in Japan. And he kind of narrates the movie in voiceover. And the way that they did it is they filmed about 20 minutes of new footage of Raymond Burr interacting with Japanese American actors and lookalikes in order to make it appear like he was in the original Japanese production. So it's a lot of shots of like the Japanese character saying a line and then cutting to like the back of their head and there's Raymond Burr talking to them. So like, that he's not really talking to this person.
That's ridiculous.
Right? It's just some like rando in a wig sitting there. And the biggest change to this movie is that they basically cut the entire political point of the movie and make it just like a big old monster movie.
Sounds about right.
So there was a huge debate about the atomic bombings in this country, about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and our continued nuclear testing. So the movie studio, probably correctly, thought that American audiences, especially returning veterans, families of returning veterans, anyone sympathetic to returning veterans, were not going to be real interested in a movie that was basically about how the United States are terrible people who devastated an entire country. So they cut all of that out. Instead of the movie ending with the lady scientist warning everyone that if we don't stop nuclear testing, another Godzilla will rise, it ends with Raymond Burr basically saying, "Well, he's dead," and like that's it.
Yeah.
So they basically cut the entire political commentary of the movie. Which is really too bad, because then that's, the political message of Godzilla has been lost for so long. And so many people only know Godzilla as this, like, B-movie, kind of goofy monster who sometimes is a bad guy and sometimes he's a good guy. And then he gets Son of Godzilla, which I always loved Baby Godzilla. And on my first Damian went as Baby Godzilla this year for Halloween. I think my first Halloween costume was Baby Godzilla. So, but it's really too bad that sort of the legacy and the point of this movie was just like erased from anyone outside of Japan's knowledge, pretty much. I mean, like I said, if you guys have seen it anytime before 2006, probably even like 2010, I guarantee that you have seen the American version, which is not bad, but not as good once you see the Japanese version, once you understand what they were really going for. I remember when it came out on DVD and my dad and I watched it, and we both agreed that we had no interest in ever watching the American version again. The Japanese version is just so much better.
Yeah, it is. And the only reason I'm aware of this is because I saw a video on YouTube about it.
Yeah, it's really kind of too bad. And actually, Japan released a Godzilla movie a few years ago called, like, Toho Godzilla, I think. And it takes place in the aftermath of, I can't remember the name of the town, Maybe one of you guys remember it. But after the tsunami where they had those nuclear reactors melt down, Fukushima?
Yes.
Fukushima? Okay. It's continuing the political message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the recent American Godzillas were not bad, but don't continue that message, really.
Oh, no.
Mm-hmm.
They're not bad. They're fun. They're what I would call a fun movie.
They are. But they do shy away from...
They do shy away from the political statements, which is really the point. So that's Godzilla. This movie is near and dear to my heart. Like I said, I watched this movie for the first time when I was 3 years old. My mother was extremely mad at my dad for bringing it home because she thought I was going to get scared. And there's a part... So, of course, obviously the American version is dubbed in English. It does not have subtitles. It's dubbed. And there's a part where Godzilla smashes a guy by stepping on him. And then a full, 15 seconds later, the guy screams. And I thought it was so funny. I just kept making my parents rewind the VHS. I just kept going, again! And they'd have to rewind it, and then I would just crack up laughing all over again. So that was...
I remember, as a kid, I don't remember specifically the movie, but I remember watching Godzilla movies that were dubbed.
Oh, they're all dubbed. Yeah, all the American versions
But they were
dubbed.
like you said, they were hilarious.
Yes.
Because the dubbing was so bad.
Well, and because it takes a lot longer to say things in Japanese than it does in English. Yeah. So the dialogue has stopped, but their mouths are still going. A lot of the time. I mean, dubbed movies are pretty awful in general. But that was my introduction to horror, guys. If it wasn't for Godzilla, I might not be on this podcast right now. Nikki, go!
Okay, mine's a little bit different. I chose the 1958 Hammer horror film, Horror of Dracula. And it was directed by Terrence Fisher, and it starred Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Melissa Stribling. I don't know if I said her name correctly. Just a side note, Lee and Cushing made over 20 Hammer films together, which I did not know. They were in them together. So I don't really want to linger too long on the plot because it's Dracula. They basically changed a few things, but there are some interesting changes they made. So this is the first Hammer horror film that I had seen, and I'm quite sad because I really loved it, and I'm going to have to watch a ton more of them. So right away I noticed that this is going to be an extravagant film because all the sets are extravagant and all the colors are just popping, beautiful, different colors everywhere. And I could just sit there and watch them do nothing for 2 hours. I don't even care if there's a story because I want to look at the rooms that they're in. So that already had me hooked. These are obviously British films, so everyone in there, British accent, doesn't matter where you're from. Dracula, British. So, it does start with Jonathan Harker, who is going to be Count Dracula's personal librarian. Pretty awesome. Sign me up, I would say. And this is where they started to change it, and it kind of domino effects all the way down. So Harker knows a little bit about vampires already, so he knows what he's seeing when he sees it. And I'm very surprised because to me, Jonathan Harker in the book was this really just very average and clueless guy. And, so they kind of did that too, but Van Helsing still has to go looking for him. And I'm well, yeah, he's going to go save his ass because Jonathan Harker is the main character, right? In the the protagonist, I suppose, besides Van Helsing. And that I thought was a lot more accurate because I never understood how he got himself out of that situation in the book. I thought it was really a miracle that he ever escaped from that castle. So actually he dies, he becomes a vampire, and Dracula turns Lucy, his fiance, I believe, as revenge for the companion that Van Helsing killed. There was a woman in the castle. And I was expecting these films to be really bloody just because I know that color films were recent. So I just knew they were rejoicing in all the visual effects that they could have. But it wasn't at all. It really wasn't. But there's one moment that sticks out when Van Helsing drives a stake into Lucy's heart. I don't recall ever hearing so clearly the sound of a stake cracking someone's rib cage. It was really subtle. I mean, I've seen a lot of vampire films, but for some reason that one, it made me cringe a little bit. And it wasn't as cheesy as I thought it could have been, which really surprised me. I was just expecting this, like, cheeseball horror film, and I didn't get it. Some parts were cheesy, but,
Let me ask really quick.
Yeah.
Is this the one, because they made several of these Dracula movies.
Yes.
Is this the one where they're, like, hanging the guys upside down and they slit all of their throats? Like,
no, this is the first Dracula Hammer horror film adaptation of the. They blend together.
I've seen like 4 or 5 of them, and I can't remember what one that scene is from because that's a scene that sticks with me. So
that's not the one, and it's really not egregiously bloody or anything.
Okay.
Anyway, so the guys aren't doing a very good job watching Mina after Lucy dies. Mina, I can't remember, but they changed their relationships because Jonathan Harker wasn't there, so they had to make Arthur a more main character, and that kind of screwed things up for me. Like, I couldn't figure out who was related to who until, like, late in the movie. But anyway, the guys aren't doing a very good job of watching Mina, and Mina starts to become enthralled to Dracula. And I think this is a good time to bring up how good I thought the acting was. Like, the guys mostly had to stand there and seem very grave, but there was a real depth of emotion from Mina, the wife, and from their little daughter. They I don't know what they did to make her cry, like, but she actually, I believed them, and that was very astonishing to me too. So but then near the end of the film, although I still love it, I'm gonna say I love it, the end of the film kind of falls apart because these are very fast-paced movies. I'm talking like an hour and 20 minutes. So the climax and the resolution happen in 10 minutes. I'm thinking, like, how are they gonna get back to Transylvania and chase Dracula through? No, that's not what they did. Like, Dracula just straight up is staying in their basement and, like, picks Mina up and tries to bury her alive because he starts panicking, and it is hilarious. But I had a good time. So
I always got the sense with this movie that, like, they were running out of film and they didn't have any money to buy more, so they were like, oh shit, we gotta wrap this up, you guys.
Well, I saw in one article that all the Hammer films are extremely fast paced and cut to the chase, so I don't know if that was a stylistic choice or what. I know they were made for nothing, but anyway,
yes.
I never thought I'd see a vampire use a shovel, but man, he was, like, frantically digging that hole trying to get her in there. I thought it was hilarious. And his, like, attempted getaway is not at all how I pictured it. He's just, like, awkwardly running away with his cape flying everywhere, and he's clumsily throwing shit at them to get them to stop. It's really bad. And I'll spoil the ending, too, because I'm having so much fun. So Van Helsing is fighting Dracula, right? The final hero-villain battle. And Van Helsing's on the table, and he does this goofy leap from the top of the table onto the curtains to pull them open, and he dustifies Dracula. It was a hot mess.
It's amazing. It's like Spider-Man. He does, like, the Spider-Man move.
So then you
so
just
ridiculous.
gotta see it. You gotta see it.
This is what I'm saying. That's where I get the sense that, like, they were, like, about to go over budget, or they were running out of film, and they didn't have any more money, so they crammed the last, like, 20 pages of the script into, like, 3 pages. Like, we gotta wrap this up.
Yeah, it was great. So let's get to why this is culturally relevant, and it actually is. I know we had all this, like, really heavy stuff earlier, and this is a little bit lighter, but it's mostly about the British, of course, because this is coming from a British studio. So Hammer Studio had its heyday from 1955 to 1976, but they're still making films today. I don't know what their last one was. They are still making films, so do you know, Rachel? You kind of nodded, so... Oh, okay.
No, I like, vaguely was aware that they were still making movies, but I probably have not seen anything past, like, the 70s.
Okay.
Because they're probably not
Wait.
great.
They're not.
It says the Woman in Black was made by them.
Really? I love
Really?
The Woman in Black.
I know.
Do you mean, like,
Really?
the new one?
Yeah,
Or the
Hammer Film
old...
Productions. Yeah.
Okay.
Let Me In.
Let Me In was made by them?
Really? Okay, well...
That's what Google says.
I guess we take that
Guys,
back.
and here I am, like, shitting all over
The Vampire Lovers. That was the Carmilla movie.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
that is Hammer horror. That is true. That is Hammer horror.
Wow.
And here I am shitting all over the studio. Wow, don't I feel bad?
So if someone were to ask what are the characteristics of a Hammer horror film, I would say specifically from this time period, they're kind of abstract. Like, I couldn't access... There was this article that did a formulaic analysis of what should be included in a Hammer horror film, and I couldn't get to it because you had to pay. But from reading various articles and just from, like, watching the film and kind of assessing as kind of a newcomer to their films, I got a pretty good sense. So this person who wrote this article, his last name is Iberi. He describes them as having a somber, artful loveliness, which I would absolutely agree to, especially more so even now that I know they made The Woman in Black, probably following that tradition. They're more subtle than gory, at least the one that I saw, more like, and he also used the word a drawing room mystery, and they have colorful sets of, and when they do show blood, it's bright red like paint, which you would think it would look stupid, but it's really cool. It's like a very specific stylistic choice. And more than once, in more than one article, I saw the word atmospheric. So that's kind of a picture of what a Hammer horror film is. And according to Mike Sutton from the British Film Institute, these films didn't actually receive serious critical attention until 1973, and that was when a book called A Heritage of Horror by David Peary was released. Apparently that was when people started really discovering them or rediscovering them. Actually, would be discovering because they would be still going in their heyday. So this is how they're culturally significant. So this guy, I'm going to butcher his name, Bilge Iberi, he wrote for the Village Voice this beautiful article on Hammer horror films, almost like a tribute. And he said their approach to making the horror films after World War II was asking themselves the questions, how exactly do you make horror horrific again when your audience has lived through World War II and knows that the planet can now be destroyed in all sorts of previously unthinkable ways? So how do you scare people? Like, we've already seen the worst. So, this critic Brian Wilson specifically ties this theme to the British mindset after World War II. And in the abstract to his article, and it's a long one, but I'm going to give the title so you can go check it out if you want, Notes on a Radical Tradition, Subversive Ideological Applications in the Hammer Horror Films. He notes that, and this is a quote from him, I just couldn't put it any better way. He says the emergence of Hammer Studios as a major force in British cinema during the early 1950s marked a direct reaction to post-war optimism and the subsequent rise of a conservative political system. So it was in opposition to this conservative way of thinking. And, quote again, in emphasizing violence and sexual liberation, Hammer challenged the dominant moral codes and proper standards of good taste imposed by the establishment. In its attempts to subvert these structures, it also engendered progressive ideological forms challenging censorship restrictions and the rigid patterns of traditional British cinema. It's interesting that Rachel brought up the censorship deal because I believe a similar thing was going on in Britain at the time, where there were a lot of laws against doing and saying certain things in films, and so this was kind of like a fuck you to those.
Right.
I guess I didn't do much research on this, and I really wish I would have, but it would have been a rabbit hole. So I don't know if, like, those laws had been lifted and now they could do it, or I mean, it must have been, right? Because they made the film, so.
Yeah, I don't know if it was like... So, I mean, here's the thing. So, the production code in Hollywood, and maybe this was the same in Britain, it wasn't like a law. It was just basically like, you cannot make a movie for our studio, a major studio, if you do not follow this code.
Okay.
And so that was what the court case was, is basically saying, by telling us we cannot do these certain things, they're infringing on our right to free speech.
Okay.
So I wonder if it was the same in Britain, where it was like a rule with the major studios. So Hammer, being an independent studio,
they could do whatever they wanted.
Fuck you, we don't need your money. Yeah. We're going to do what we want.
And then,
but I have no idea.
Shit, we're running out of film.
Right.
Dig the hole faster.
I'm telling you, that's exactly what I always feel like with those movies, is that they realize they're running out of film, and so they have to, like, wrap it up right away.
So Abiri kind of echoed this, and he just said, I just love some of the quotes from this article. He said that when you're watching one of these films, one is seized with a sense of possibility and abandon. And that's kind of exactly how I felt while I was watching it. I was like, this is just such a rich world that I want to get into, and I was hooked. And I saw this especially with the scenes with Mina. Speaking of liberation, this film drives home the sexuality of the Dracula story. There's a scene, you know, where Dracula comes into the bedroom and she's just like transfixed and he lays her down on the bed, and it's just very, very sensual. And I guess I'm not wrong, because this guy who wrote this article also says that even softcore porn probably owes Hammer a nod of thanks. So that was an interesting thing to learn. But yeah, so mine turned out to be a little more lighthearted. It was kind of more about reorienting a nation after the war, but kind of doing it in a more positive way, I guess.
Well, and you have to look also at the way that Britain was affected by the war is extremely different from the way that the United States was affected by the war. I mean, we were not being bombed constantly, and you know, I know with World War I, maybe someone with more knowledge on World War II could tell me, but I know during World War I mean, like, all the boys in a village were going off and just, like, never coming back, and, like, an entire generation was just wiped out. And I don't know if that's the same in World War II, but I know for World War I that was certainly the case.
Right.
Yeah, so, I mean, you have to see how I could see where it would be more difficult, you know, in Great Britain with what they... I mean, there were still, up until I don't even know when, people were finding, like, bombs from World War II that were dropped but never detonated in, like, the sewer system. And they were having to do controlled explosions and pull them out, and yeah. That's if anyone watches Call the Midwife, that happens in an episode of Call the Midwife.
Ooh.
But yeah, so, I mean, obviously their effects from World War II were way different than ours. Way different. But I also like that you brought up, you know, how it brings out more of the sexuality of Dracula, because those social mores, obviously, in the 50s were starting to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're getting close to the 60s by now, and obviously 58, so...
Mm-hmm. And, you know, women at this time had realized after the war that maybe they didn't want to go back home.
Yeah.
You know? They liked working during the war. They liked being independent and being contributing members of society. And maybe they didn't want to go back into the kitchen.
Right. It is nice having your labor be visible, right?
Exactly. And to have more than one future laid out for you. You know, you don't just go to college for your Mrs. degree, right? Mm-hmm. You can actually go to college and have a career.
Yeah.
Or you can get a job and maybe you don't have to get married right away, right out of high school. Maybe you can, like, be a working girl, you know?
It's interesting that you say that, because I think this film also taps a little bit into men's fears of being run away on, I suppose, by their wives, you know?
I think most of the Dracula stories do, and the fear of these women being taken over by this, like, uncontrollable lust, right? Because, I mean, Dracula, I mean, the vampire is, I mean, clearly it's supposed to be pretty sexy. I mean, he's coming into your room at night, and he's biting your neck and hypnotizing you with his eyes. I mean, I can see it. Mm-hmm. I clearly would fall victim in, like, half a second. I mean, I have no willpower, so...
Oh, yeah.
I'd be like, well, I'm fucked, guys, sorry. But yeah, I mean, so you can definitely see, though, how it gets more pronounced in the Dracula movies as time goes on. Until you get to the one with Keanu Reeves and Winona Ryder, where she's, like, fully, like, almost bearing her boobs. I mean, yeah. There's, like, full wolf-on-human sex in that movie. I mean...
This one was extremely subtle. I mean, there was really nothing about it but context and mood that really made it sexual, I guess. It wasn't, like... There were no naked people in it. I mean, at least that I recall, but...
No, but I always like thinking about it. How would an audience in 1958 have seen that? You know, like, to us, we're kind of like, well, it's just kind of a sexy movie. I mean, it's not that bad. But in the 50s, do you think you would have been scandalized? Or shocked?
I think I would have. I mean,
I think so
how
too.
long ago was it that we weren't showing, and I don't know if this was the same for Britain, but how long ago was it that we weren't showing a man and a woman sleeping in the same bed together, let alone, like, the scene that I just described? You know, they had twin beds, like, you know, everyone in America does, I guess. Like, the wife sleeps on this twin bed, and the, and the husband.
And yet, somehow they still have kids.
Yeah. It's the stork.
Yes,
everybody knows that.
It is.
Come
the
on.
Stork brings the baby. I mean, look at I Love Lucy. Was that in this?
That was my first...
Early 60s?
That was my first thought. Was
that
I Love Lucy
on in the early 60s? Late 50s, early 60s? But she was the first... Right. She was the first woman to actually be pregnant on TV. Like, she was pregnant in real life. And her character was pregnant. But they put her in these, like, huge muumuus because they didn't want to show her belly. Because that was considered obscene. And she and Ricky slept in separate beds.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's cute.
Yeah. I mean, it was just in the 90s. I remember when they started allowing, like, network TV to show bare butts. Because it was on NYPD Blue, and I remember sneaking down to the basement to watch it because I wanted to see a bare butt. I was like 7. But I remember sneaking downstairs to watch NYPD Blue, which I was not supposed to be watching, because it was this big deal that there was going to be a bare butt on TV. Because you had to watch, like, HBO or Cinemax to see somebody naked. Right? You couldn't see it on, like, regular TV. We're a country of prudes.
I think that's a good ending.
It's a great ending.
Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget you can follow us on Twitter at QOTD Podcast, on Facebook at facebook.com/QOTD Podcast, Tumblr at queensofthedamnpodcast.tumblr.com, and YouTube at Queens of the Damn Podcast.
Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play, and TuneIn Radio. You can also follow us on our blog, queensofthedamnpodcast.wordpress.com, to find bonus content and extra information on our episodes.
If you would like to donate to our show, you can find us at patreon.com/QOTD podcast, where you can receive special perks as a listener for becoming a monthly patron. If you would like to make a one-time donation, you can send it to QOTDpodcast@gmail.com on PayPal. We'll see you next week.